Room 427. The door is locked from the inside. The bed is undisturbed, and yet, according to decades of guest reports, someone, or something, has been sleeping there. This is the room where Stephen King stayed for a single night in the autumn of 1974, a night that gave the world The Shining. But long before King ever set foot on the property, the Stanley Hotel already had a reputation. The question that's followed this building for over a century isn't really whether it's haunted. It's why so many different people, across so many decades, keep describing the exact same things. Welcome back to the true unknown. Let's step inside. The Stanley Hotel sits at 7,700 feet above sea level, on a ridge overlooking the town of Estes Park, Colorado, with the Rocky Mountains rising behind it like a wall of stone and snow. Construction finished in 1909, commissioned by a man named Freeland Oscar Stanley. F.A. Stanley wasn't a hotelier by trade. He was an inventor, best known, along with his twin brother Francis, for the Stanley Steamer, one of the earliest successful steam-powered automobiles. In 1898, Stanley was diagnosed with tuberculosis. His doctors gave him only months to live. Seeking cleaner air, he traveled to the Colorado high country, and something remarkable happened. His health improved. He recovered enough to live another 36 years. Grateful and struck by the beauty of the region, Stanley decided to build a grand hotel for wealthy travelers and fellow health seekers. The result was a striking white Georgian Revival building, incongruous against the raw Colorado wilderness, all the more so because it was fully wired for electricity at a time when the surrounding town still relied on candlelight and oil lamps. Stanley even installed his own hydroelectric plant to power it. It was, by any measure, an ambitious, forward-looking project, which makes what happened there all the more curious. The stories begin almost immediately after opening. The most frequently cited is Mrs. Elizabeth Wilson, the hotel's head housekeeper during the Stanley's era. In 1911, a severe storm knocked out the hotel's power. Wilson was in room 217, lighting acetylene lamps, when a gas leak caused an explosion. She fell through the floor, breaking both her ankles, but survived. She continued working at the Stanley for years afterward. According to hotel staff accounts passed down over generations, guests and employees have long reported her presence still lingering in that room. A housekeeping figure who turns down beds, unpacks luggage, or tidies belongings before any staff member has entered. It's important to note this is oral tradition and guest testimony, not something that can be independently verified. But the consistency of the story, told by different staff across different decades, is part of what's kept it alive. Then there's F.O. Stanley himself. Guests and staff have reported seeing a tall, well-dressed man in the billiard room and the lobby, matching descriptions of Stanley from photographs, sometimes years before those photographs were widely circulated for visitors to recognize him from. His wife, Flora Stanley, an accomplished pianist, is said to be heard playing the concert hall piano late at night, long after the room has been locked and cleared. Room 428 has its own documented history worth noting for context, though it centers on Stephen King's stay rather than a death or accident. King and his wife Tabitha arrived at the Stanley in September of 1974. It was the tail end of the season. The hotel was nearly empty, preparing to close for winter. King later described walking through the vacant, echoing halls, dining alone in a grand room meant for hundreds, and that night, having a vivid nightmare about his young son being chased through the corridors by a fire hose come to life. He woke up, and by the time he finished his cigarette, he said, he had the outline of The Shining in his head. The Overlook Hotel of the novel is not a literal depiction of the Stanley. King has said the geography and details diverge significantly, and the notorious hedge maze, for instance, appears nowhere in the real building. But the atmosphere, the isolation, the sense of a grand structure holding on to its own history, that came directly from his one night's stay. It's worth being clear about something often blurred in retellings. Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film adaptation was not shot at the Stanley Hotel at all. It was filmed primarily on sound stages in England, with exterior shots borrowed from Oregon's Timberline Lodge. The famous television miniseries adaptation from 1997, which King himself was involved in, was filmed on location at the Stanley. That's often where the visual association the public carries actually comes from. So what do we actually have, evidence-wise, beyond stories passed hotel to hotel, guest to guest? There are guest logs and staff testimonies spanning more than a century, describing phenomena with notable consistency. Unexplained cold spots, particularly around room 418, where families with children have reported hearing the pattering of small feet and children's laughter in the hallway at night, despite no children being registered on that floor. There are accounts of self-playing pianos in the music room. There are reports from the fourth floor specifically, which staff have long referred to as the location of the most frequent unexplained activity. Paranormal investigation teams have visited the Stanley repeatedly since the 1990s, using instruments like electromagnetic field detectors and infrared cameras, techniques used across the field of amateur paranormal investigation more broadly. None of these tools are scientifically validated as capable of detecting ghosts. An EMF spike can be explained by faulty wiring, old electrical systems, or nearby appliances, all of which are unsurprising in a building with electrical infrastructure dating back over 100 years. Cold spots can result from drafts, uneven insulation, or the simple physics of a large stone and wood structure at high altitude. These are the mundane, testable explanations that any fair accounting of the evidence has to include. There's also a psychological and environmental theory worth taking seriously. The Stanley sits at significant elevation in a region known for dramatic pressure changes, and some researchers who study reported hauntings more broadly have pointed to factors like infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing that can be produced by high winds moving across certain architecture, and which some laboratory studies have associated with feelings of unease, cold sensations, or a sense of being watched. Whether infrasound is actually present and measurable at the Stanley specifically hasn't been rigorously documented in peer-reviewed research. It remains a plausible contributing factor rather than a proven cause. There's also the undeniable power of expectation. The Stanley has spent decades marketing itself, quite openly, around its haunted reputation. It offers nightly ghost tours. It leans into the Shining connection with gift shop merchandise and themed events. Psychologists who study perception have long noted that when people are primed to expect something unusual in an unfamiliar, dimly lit, unusually quiet environment, they are more likely to interpret ordinary stimuli, a creaking floorboard, a shifting curtain, a gust through an old window frame, as something extraordinary. And yet, the stories persist among people who have no financial or promotional interest in the hotel's reputation. Staff who've worked there for decades, off the record and on, describe experiences they say they can't otherwise explain. Guests write reviews, unprompted, describing the same specific details: footsteps on the fourth floor, a woman in the 200 wing, without necessarily having heard the older stories first. Consistency across independent, unconnected witnesses over more than 100 years is not proof of anything supernatural. But it is a genuine pattern, and patterns are worth taking seriously even when we can't fully explain them. What we're left with is a building with real, documented history, a tuberculosis survivor's improbable recovery, a housekeeper's genuine accident, a novelist's genuinely sleepless night that became one of the most famous horror stories ever written. Layered on top of that documented history is 100 years of testimony that resists tidy explanation, alongside plausible mundane causes that resist tidy dismissal. The Stanley Hotel doesn't need embellishment. Its real history is strange enough on its own. The ghosts, if that's what they are, arrived afterward and never really left. So the question isn't whether the Stanley is haunted. It's why a building's history can feel so alive that after a century, people still can't stop hearing footsteps in its empty halls. If you found this story as compelling as we did, subscribe to The True Unknown. We're uncovering the real mysteries history left behind, one story at a time.